Welcome to Psych Incubator and Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed. I'm Jeffrey Magnavita, and with my co-hosts Michael Albert and Elizabeth Magnavita, we are pleased to feature David Allen, who is a professor emeritus of psychiatry and the former director of psychiatric residency training at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center in Memphis. David is the author of the self-help book, Coping with Critical, Demanding, and Dysfunctional Parents, Powerful Strategies to Help Adult Children Maintain Boundaries and Stay Sane. He is also the author of How Dysfunctional Families Spur Mental Disorders, co-editor of Groupthink in Science, and the author of 3 books for psychotherapists, A Family Systems Approach to Individual Therapy, Deciphering Motivation in Psychotherapy, and Psychotherapy with Borderline Patients. Additionally, he has done research into personality disorders and is a psychotherapy theorist. He is a former associate editor of the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration, and David and I have known each other for a number of years, and it's such a pleasure to have you here, David, to hear about your work and your ideas and to share your expertise with the psychotherapists out there who are in the front lines trying to help people with their struggles. So, David, welcome to Psych Incubator and Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Let's kick it off with, can you tell us a little bit about what brought you to this field and how you've become passionate about what you do?
Well, I was originally interested in hard science as a kid, and I thought I was going to go in that route, but I didn't get it. I tried to get into Caltech. I'm from LA and didn't get it. And I went to UC Berkeley. This terrible physical science school, but I found out that lab work and I really didn't get along. You're kind of cramped up in this building, and there was some pressure in my family to become a doctor. So I figured, well, that's science. And when I got to medical school, the very first clinical rotation I did was psychiatry, and I was just blown away by it because I'd always wondered. You see people the way they behave in high school at the different cliques and all this stuff. You wonder, why are they acting that way? And when you're dating, you run into a lot of issues, really strange situations. So I was absolutely fascinated. And transactional analysis was big at that time. And I read games people play, and so did another student. And he was saying, gee, the more you read this, the more it seems real and all that. So I really got into psychiatry, and I really didn't enjoy the other fields of medicine. I'm glad I went to medical school because I did prescribe. I was also a prescriber. I didn't just do psychotherapy, and I often did both. So you did have to know all that stuff because the drugs interact with not only psychiatric symptoms, but other physical symptoms and other drugs and diseases. So you really do have to know about all that stuff if you're going to prescribe. So I'm glad I went, but I went into residency at USC. And the second year they started psychotherapy, and I found that really interesting, but I thought I didn't know what I was getting into because the first patient I had was giving this incredibly hard time, complaining about me to my supervisor, telling me how awful I was. I go, what did I sign up for? But then I started wondering, why on earth would anybody act this way? She's not mad. She's not crazy, in other words. She's not bad.
You weren't feeling appreciated.
Well, to say the least, I was feeling attacked. And I found that people that have this disorder, which wasn't even in the DSM yet, by the way, borderline personality disorder, it was a pseudo neurotic schizophrenia or something along like that, they were calling it, stuff like that. They were unanalyzable, some people were saying. But I had to figure out, why would anybody do this? Because she admitted at the end of the year that she was impressed with me that I wasn't throwing her out of the office when she was insulting me. Not in hindsight, but telling me what she was thinking at the time. So she was admiring she was doing this to me, and I go, what? That's crazy. Why would anybody do? So if they're not mad, they're not bad, and they're not stupid. Stupid seems to be the big one. Everybody thinks these people are just so stupid that if you step on a board and hit you in the face, maybe you miss it the first time and hit you in the face the second time, but you're not going to keep hitting on the board. But they kept doing it.
Yes.
So I got turned off, though, to psychotherapy because the analysts were in charge. They were almost cult-like in terms of you couldn't question anything that they said without being accused of being resistant to the idea, which is very cult-like and it's very group-thinkish. That became an interest later. So you had to go along with the group or else you were persona non grata. So you couldn't question anything. Well, I always grew up questioning everything. My parents sort of taught me that it's okay to do that. Critical thinking, that sort of thing. So I got turned off to it, but then a friend of mine introduced me to the book Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn, which talked about when sciences get started, they always have a lot of different competing theories. And psychiatry, especially because we can't read minds and people lie all the time and they're very defensive. So they don't tell you the whole story, or they don't know what's important and they leave a lot of stuff out. So
Or they don't know the whole story sometimes.
they don't know the whole story. They certainly don't. They don't know why their parents are acting the way that they're, and they're very protective of their families. I found out they'd rather we hate them than hate their families.
Loyalty.
Well,
It's family loyalty.
they're clinging to their connection.
So when people don't bring up child abuse, it's not to protect their own feelings. Guess what? It's to
Protect
protect
their abusers.
the
Yeah.
abuser.
It's
The
a big
attachment.
So even when they do come forward, they'll be like, Roseanne Barr saying she remembers being molested when she was 6 months old. Well, nobody's going to believe that. So nobody believes her. Well, I don't think she remembers that, but I guarantee there was things going on in that family that we don't know and she didn't mention about. So I found various ways to get at the truth, because very smart people would come in and they wouldn't tell me really important triggers. I was sort of a behaviorist in a sense. I thought we could still think, but I didn't think it was, electric shocks and food pellets that shape our behavior. I think it's our social relationships as being we're the most social of all species, just about, except maybe ants and bees. So what are they getting out of that? And then, so I started reading all the major theorists, and I found that each one had a lot to say, but then they had things that didn't make any sense and were off. And sometimes they were talking about the same thing, but using it from a different angle. Like, for instance, the irrational thoughts that Beck and Ellis were talking about, I found serve the exact same function as defense mechanisms. They stop people from doing what they really want to do. They stop people from self-actualizing, to borrow from Gestalt therapy and Carl Jung and all that. So they serve the same function, even though they're slightly different versions. And I got into logical fallacies, and that I used to think they were just mistakes in reasoning, and I found out there are ways to avoid thinking certain things or noticing certain things that they weren't supposed to notice. I mean, if you're sitting in church and everybody's oohing and ahhing at everything the pastor is saying, including your parents, you're probably not going to question it too hard. And if you do, forget it. Get slammed down. So that was groupthink. I didn't know about groupthink at the time. And then sort of the pieces of puzzle came together that they're doing it sort of to protect their parents. But that's something that most therapists think is crazy, because, we think, especially Americans, that everybody's selfish. And we certainly are in certain contexts. Okay. But in the family, we're willing to sacrifice ourselves to stabilize unstable parents, even at the expense of our own wishes and desires, to fit in. You get sort of punished if you don't. You get excluded. You don't even get thrown out of you don't even get exiled.
Well, it also is in our best interest when we stabilize it when we were a kid, because stabilizing the dyad then also gives us security, right? Even if we're absorbing the anxiety and tension from the conflict and stabilizing them, we're preserving the family unit in a way. So it does.
Right. We have a role, and we have something to live for in a way. It's our purpose in life almost. But with the advance of culture and the evolution of culture and the rules changing constantly about what families are supposed to do and what constitutes family homeostasis, or the keeping the family sort of stable, it keeps changing. So people develop conflicts, and where I think Freud got it wrong is he was just looking at the conflict within one person, when I think the whole family shared it.
So if you were to pick out of all the theories that you've studied, and I know that you've done a deep dive into different theoretical models, if you were to have to pick one that you thought was the most groundbreaking out of all the theoretical models that you studied, David, which one would you pick?
Well, the one that most influenced me, because he seemed to put all this stuff together in a certain way, was Murray Bowen.
Yeah. Well, and that's who I'd pick. I mean, it's amazing what he did, and it's sad how little he's actually of his work has been taken up in the clinical realm.
Well, there are Bowen therapy schools. People are really into it. I had this one person I was
But
sort
it's
of trying
not.
to
It's
get. She
not
said
been.
that
It's
not
not
been
really been
wide. No.
absorbed. What about you, Michael? Who would you pick?
You know, I'm not sure that.
You can't say me.
No, I'm not going to be. No, I think that there are a lot of people today who are moving in the direction.
No, but I mean, if you were to pick one theorist that you feel is like the most influential out of all the ones that you studied, who would you pick?
You know, um, I actually think that there's chunks from many of them. I liked a lot of things that Yalom had to say. Right?
Yeah, okay.
I think basically
Existential psychotherapy.
I think it didn't solve the problem.
But that's who you would pick
fine. Yeah.
if you had to pick one.
What I really wanted to say is that I think that that recognition of all these behaviors as defenses changes the playing field. I mean, I think that's the key. And I think that, you know, if you're going to spend all your time not understanding what's happening and saying they're just too sick, then you're not going to get very far.
And from our early career psychotherapist, Lizzie, who would you?
I have to think about that answer. I don't even know what I would say. I don't know.
Who's
There's
most
like kind of like Michael's saying, there's so many bits. I don't think there's one specific that I would be able to pick out, because I feel like, especially these days, we use so many pieces from everything. I use this one thing from this. You know,
I think we all agree to that.
Yeah. I'm curious, David, about when you're talking about, you know, whatever you want to call it, defense mechanisms, whatever it is, how do you talk about it with your patients? Like, how do you what language do you use when you share, like, is this what's going on with you?
It's important to validate that, but there's another thing that I wrote. My second book is about ambiguity. Any sentence in any language can be interpreted in at least two different ways. I found that if you took the less obvious one and used that, you were on the right track most of the time, not all the time. Yeah. So I would wonder about, something that's called the fictional detective way of questioning is you put the stupidity on you. You go, you said this, and I'm having a hard time putting it. Columbo style of questioning. And then they want to help you, so then to tell you how you, and then you found out they're not opposites. That there's something that ties everything.
But Lizzie, are you asking about whether the language of it, like would David actually say it's a defense or an adaptive strategy or a internal belief? Is that what
yeah, like when, you know, you're with your patient, are you like, this is a defense mechanism, or like, what might you say?
Well, what do I tell them?
Yeah, like when you're talking about it with them.
Like, I don't really define it as such.
Got it.
I want to understand who's doing what in the family that seems to be related to what they're doing.
So you wouldn't say
stories that I learned.
But you wouldn't say a certain repetitive action pattern it's a defensive pattern, or it's a adaptive strategy that you use to keep your internal attachment secure.
No. What I would usually say is, no wonder you act that way.
Yeah, I think that is key. When you notice they're acting a particular way, you say, what's going on right now that's causing this to happen? Is this what you do? What are you feeling?
Interesting. So you guys don't label it as a strategy.
No, it's a clue to tell you this is a hot spot, and if you want to take a big bite, you're going to be poisoned. So you better.
Right. No, I agree. I understand that, but I'm just wondering. It sounds like you both have somewhat different styles of engaging with that action pattern.
I
You know,
was gonna say something,
I
well, you
praise
must have
them.
a good reason for doing that because you don't really seem to be enjoying it much.
And so I would say, you know, I know you're trying hard. You've come, and this is a hard thing to do. So, you know, what's it like being here with me?
Yeah, I try to minimize transference, though. That's another thing that I see people. I saw my borderline patients, people with borderline personality disorder, every 2 weeks instead of every one, to sort of minimize the transference. I didn't want them to transfer their craziness onto me. I wanted them to deal with the source of it, which was their parents usually. And then you get accused of, oh, you're blaming parents. No, it's a question of solving problems. It's not a question of blame, because these problems are transported from one generation to another for a long time. So that's the wrong question. The question is not who's to blame, but how do we fix this? Because they're all, one Bowen therapist told me they're all in the same soup. They're all beans in the same soup. So I said, let's just blame Adam and Eve and get that out of the way, and let's talk about how to fix this. That's the, because you're all to blame or nobody's to blame. You're all just responding to various things, and it makes sense to you to act that way. And I can see why, I can understand why you do, but I don't agree that that's the best way to go about it. That's empathy versus sympathy. I'm not sympathetic to a child abuser, for instance, but I can be empathic, which, well, you have to do that to justify why your dad did it to you. You deserved it, I guess. For instance, that would be a very unusual example.
So can I just I think what you're saying, David, it sounds intriguing and important to me. You can sympathize with the abuser, but you can empathize with
yes. They won't accept sympathy because
say a little bit more about that. I think that might be a useful distinction for me and probably for other people.
Well, if you're saying sympathy to me is, maybe it's just my own definition, is sort of empathy plus, yeah, it was okay. But if you say that to a child abuser, they know you're not being serious, because they know it's wrong, despite their protestations of innocence. They know what people think of child abusers. It's not a secret. So if you say it's okay, they'll know you're full of crap, basically. Whereas I can see why you felt you had to do that. It's kind of a shame, but I wonder how else you can solve that.
Okay.
Well, you know, I have had a number of patients who first sexual experiences were away at camp. And obviously, since at that point your counselors are the same sex, they were essentially kind of brought into the little inner circle, and that's where their sexual attachment continued to be, even though they didn't have any other particularly strange thing about them. And they didn't know what to do. They didn't know, where do you go when you don't want to.
So why couldn't they tell their parents? They must have sensed some reason why that would not have been a good idea. Like, I think if a stranger abuses you, that's one thing. As if a family member,
it's something
completely different.
Or a trusted authority. Or a trusted authority, right? Counselor.
Like with the Catholic priest thing,
right?
They couldn't, because their parents were idealizing the priest all the time. They knew that they wouldn't be believed if they said he did this. So they kept it quiet.
And often one of the parents was afraid of joining with the child, because what would they do?
Out of the church. They would be kicked out of the congregation, probably. It took several people coming out together at the same time. Same thing with Me Too. I mean, the casting couch is as old as movies. So why did women let men get away with it? Because nobody would believe them. How did they solve that problem? They looked for other people that had the same thing happen to them, and they all came out together. Suddenly they're a lot more believable that they did that, and it worked. So you're wondering, though, but why didn't somebody think of that a little sooner? Was the sexism that bad? Well, yes. It actually was.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a societal effect too that affects everybody. So what I found is the same thing relates to what Jeff's written about a little bit. The same patterns were going on at every level. It was going on intrapsychically, within the family, within the kin group, within the ethnic group, and within the larger society. It's called parallel process. So the analysts wrote about parallel process, but not in these terms, I don't
Well,
think.
it's also through the lens of the system, that fractals. There are just fractals at every level of the system.
At every level, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a recapitulation of the organization and the structure, which I think is fascinating about system theory.
Well, I mean, again, you discover this accidentally. I overgeneralized from certain cases, but it seemed. But then I started asking about it. Like there was this one woman I had that she belonged to a Protestant sect that had broke off from a larger group in the Midwest and had moved out west. And anybody who went off to college was admired in this group like tremendously. But then they were, well, how are you managing with all these horrible stresses and stuff? They all get sucked back. And it was happening at every level. And that's what happened with her. She drops out of a PhD program. She says it was just because she doesn't make good decisions. But then I found out, well, first she blamed her husband because he'd spent all the money from her school on a boat, which turned out she had encouraged him to buy.
Well, that's where I think the Bowenian theory and the ideas of self and other differentiation are so critical to all the work that we do, because everyone is on a pathway of differentiation throughout our lives, and we see at different stages in the family life cycle, the differentiation soup gets all stirred up, and you get failure to launch when kids go off to college. You get
well, that's happening a lot
blending families. I mean, so the differentiation part that you're talking about, how do you do that work when you're in a closed system? It's very hard.
Well, and differentiation is also something relatively new in history. That's what Fromm was talking about, and other people have talked about it. There's a book called The Bicameral Mind, and people theorize about it all. But we and sociologist Mills was talking about it. We were just fitting into a group, but the groups got smaller and smaller and more differentiated. There was more and more roles to play. So we started developing more of an individualistic point of view. But Fromm said, like in the Middle Ages, you were either a knight or an artisan or farmer, and that was all you were. You weren't Joe Blow who happened to be one of those things.
You were just a group member, yeah.
Right. But then
And
things
that's what
changed.
your family had always done. You know,
And then there was a birth of narcissism in the 20th century, where now everybody is an individual and sings to their own tune.
Well, people say that they like that, but they're scared to death of it. I found they really, it's not as widespread as people think. I don't know why are some of the big celebrities killing themselves with booze and pills when they're rich and famous, and they should be happy. But I think a lot of the accidental overdoses are just sort of suicides. Really, I mean, how would you know? You can't. But like there was Philip Seymour Hoffman. He died of an overdose. He said to his friends that he was going to be dead in a few months. So he did. It's not like he didn't know that what he was doing was dangerous. Again, he wasn't stupid.
Right.
So
Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and
Jimi Hendrix. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about where you are in the unified psychotherapy sort of conceptual stew at this point in your career.
Well, I'm retired, so I'm not seeing patients, but what I did was we would try to figure out what cultural changes or traumas in the history of the family. So I'd have patients interview grandparents and aunts and uncles, and we couldn't usually trace it back more than 3 generations, but occasionally you could. But yeah, so we could come up with some reasonable understanding for why the parents felt they had to act that way. But then the question is, well, if we could talk about this, then maybe they'll quit feeding and then triggering all this stuff, and you wouldn't get invalidated if you did something else. So how do you do that? So over the years, I developed certain strategies that I was using with patients, a lot of them, for people how to approach the parent with validation and tracing. I keep 5 initial strategies I outlined in my book for approaching this. The first one that I wrote about in my first book was, do you do it by history? Well, this happened to grandma, and that's why this grandma did this way with you, and so that's why you did this way with. I saw it in my own family. It's just a little like I was always discouraged from showing off in school. I don't know why. I didn't know why at the time. But then my uncle told a story of what, because they came uh, from Russian along the Dnieper River, were Jewish. And when he was little, his first memory was there was a pogrom going on, and there was a parade going down the street carrying the head of a Jew. And his grandparents owned a bar, a tavern, and the parade stopped, and they walked in and had a drink, and then they left. I could see, well, maybe you don't want to show off in that situation. It's probably not a good idea. Probably want to keep quiet, fade into the woodwork. Oh, no wonder that's not happening now. There's no
So
pogroms going on.
so you're talking about the multi-generational transmission process, and what do you think about the work of I think Yehuda, I don't know how to say her name exactly, the neuroscientist who she recently published in Scientific American about the epigenetic transfer of trauma now, that there's some evidence that the telomeres in the ends of our genes get changed, and that gene activation can get passed to the next generation.
Well, epigenetics is mostly, yeah, there's things like that, but most epigenetics is just certain genes being turned off and on. So yeah, if you're under a certain environment, and the brain's plastic, neuroplasticity, this is what most therapists don't realize is going on. There's
What
a
do you mean?
trillion
Say
synapses.
more about that. What don't most therapists know about neuroplasticity?
If you learn something, your brain physically changes. You can't measure it on an MRI because there's a trillion synapses, and the pathways are just, maybe at some point with AI, or we might be able to do it, but we can't now. It's all over the brain. It's not just in one spot. Sometimes it is.
So that's why we say that psychotherapy actually changes the structure of the brain.
Changes the structure of the pattern, just like learning anything.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, it's use it or lose it. A synapse, if it doesn't get stimulated, will gradually get weaker and weaker and then disappear. Where if it's stimulated, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger.
Neurons wire together, wire together, link
yes.
together, link together.
Yep, use it or lose it. But there's certain pathways that are more resistant to this process than others. There are fear tracts that are part of the brain called the amygdala, which is responsible for fight and flight, that are very resistant to neuroplasticity. Yeah. And I think, and there are also cells in the amygdala that respond only to your parents and nothing else. But Harvard started researching what was going on between a baby and an infant when they were interacting. There were hundreds of synapses being formed every second during that. Now they get pruned later during adolescence.
The kindling and the pruning, yeah.
Yeah, they get pruned. But wow, and they're saying, the first they said it was 700 a second. I think that was an underestimate, is what I heard lately. Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff. No wonder they were better. The parents were better at being behavioral reinforcers than I could be as a therapist. So I didn't have that. Not to mention the whole family coming out and jumping down your throat. How can you treat your mother that way? You know, that's very intimidating.
Oh, yeah, that's causing a crisis.
That's causing a crisis. Absolutely.
And the patient comes to you for what reason?
Well, because they're self-destructive and they're unhappy, basically.
Okay, so and the strategy for helping them with that is what's the next step?
Okay, first validating and countering all their efforts to invalidate you. Especially, I'm going to talk about borderline personality disorder.
You keep validating.
You keep validating them. Then you start looking for holes in the plot and logical fallacies and defense mechanisms, irrational thoughts, and what they might represent. Then you ask what I call the key, is a question that was first devised by Alfred Adler and later adapted by certain systems therapists, which is, what would happen if I had a magic wand and I could get you to stop doing this? And they'd usually say, well, I just find some other way to screw it up. They say, well, my magic wand won't let you do that.
Well, then what?
Then they either get quiet, but it slowly starts dripping out, or they blurt out things like, well, then my mother wouldn't know what to do with herself and she'd stop sending me money. And I go, now the way I found this was interesting too. With transactional analysis, what I mentioned earlier, there's a game called Why Don't You Yes But, where they present a problem and you offer a solution and they say, well, I could do that, but, and they'd have a bunch of different solutions. Well, I played the opposite game. I said, they say, well, why I can't, why you can't, basically. I said, they give me an excuse and I say, but you could handle this by doing that. So they come up with another excuse. You could handle this by doing. So this one woman was a black belt in karate, but she couldn't keep a job. She always went home and lived with her abusive father. So she was making all these excuses, and I was saying, well, you could fix that by doing that. And then she said, well, because my dad, if I'm not there, my dad molests my little sister. And I go, oh, see, why didn't you mention that? So why don't you just report him to social services? And she says, because my mother can't manage on her own, she'd be out on the street and everybody would blame me. Well, you could handle it. Good? What the? Wait a minute. I couldn't think of a solution to that problem. No one, and I guess no wonder you don't want to leave. But they would have said, why are you? They would have looked at all her negative, self-doubting thoughts,
Right.
self-criticism, and all that, without looking at what's the consequences and what's the motivation for doing that. People have motives for this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's not coming out of nowhere. It's motivated reasoning. But you wouldn't know it, and they don't volunteer it. I mean, I found ways to get to it much quicker.
And it's not conscious often, right? It's just not something. It's not been crystallized or articulated in the way you just did. That's what the therapeutic process can help crystallize. Like,
they kind of know at some level, but 80% of what we do is just responding to social cues.
Yeah.
Without any thought or consideration. So if you get what you always got, guess what? You keep doing it.
Right.
But if you don't get what you always got,
we're pattern recognition systems.
Yeah, and you trust your therapist, then you got to stop and think about it again. But people at some level kind of know this because they kind of devised these things when they were younger.
Once you've done that work and they begin to see what's going on, how do you get them to get it to stick? Because there's this huge force of magnetism that's still pulling them back and pulling them back. And you're not always there to whisper in their ear what's happening again. So is that you become behavioristic at that point or do something else?
Yes, in a sense. Well, first of all, I have them do research in the family background. We have to come up with some sort of a theory that makes their behavior more understandable. Because the minute you start attacking somebody, it's fight, flight, or freeze immediately, and you can't solve any problem. But how do you stay empathic with somebody that's literally or figuratively kicking you in the knee at the same time? That's not easy to do. Okay, so we come up with a theory, and their behavior becomes more understandable, like my being discouraged from showing off. Now I love to show off, but it's okay. So they can do that, but they'd be invalidated. So how do we stop? We need to figure out some way to get past the parents' defenses to bring this up. And I have different strategies for starting it, and then we role play. First, I play the parent so I can really see what they're up against. Now, people ask me, how did I discover this? Well, one of the first ways is I had patients with borderline personality disorder. They're always accused of distorting everything, and they do distort, don't get me wrong. But they started bringing in tape recordings of conversations, phone conversations, these are adults, with their parents when the parents didn't know they were being recorded. And I'm listening to this stuff, and you got to listen to the whole thing. If you just listen to a little bit, you'll never understand what's going on. It's the whole picture. It's not just 5 minutes. It's your whole history of your relationship that you use to understand what somebody's telling you, okay? So I started to hear all this stuff, and then I found the Adlerian question, and then I started role-playing, and I tried different strategies and found out what they're up against and what the best way. And once we figured out a way, then there's more than one, too, because there's like 5 different kinds of denial, for instance. Somebody wrote that in Family Therapy Network. So you get past one, and then they have another one. You can't just do one little thing. And if you get into trouble, you have to have an escape strategy. So you don't ruin it for the future, but you stop it then because you don't know what to do and you don't want to make it worse. It's like, well, gee, I didn't want to get into an argument. Maybe we'll talk about this later. And then you leave. Okay, but they have to practice all that. Okay, so once we come up with the strategy, then we change places and they'd have to do the strategy. And I would be the worst possible version of their parents. You have to be a good actor in the sense of to do this. I'm from Hollywood too. So, and they'd always go back to the wrong way almost immediately. And so then you'd have to give them feedback and slowly teach them till they could do it in the role play before you dare send them out. And even then, people ask, well, how successful is this? Well, when they did the homework, it was quite successful. But a lot of people were just scared to death of doing it. No matter, even if we had a strategy, they were scared out of their minds. They couldn't get themselves to do it. So it didn't work.
It takes something very powerful to get people to change, because it's a lot of work. People don't do the homework.
They don't, but they're scared. It's not because they're just resistant. They're scared to death. And I know why they're scared, because it's terrifying when you have this experience of having your family invalidate you. That's what Marsha Linehan's even talking about, family invalidation, although she doesn't deal with it directly in her therapy. It just blows me away. She came, if you read her autobiography, Marsha Linehan, for those that don't know, is the sort of the leading guru of treating patients with borderline personality. She has something called DBT, and they focus on mindfulness and staying calm, even though you have all this stuff going on. And that's sort of, to me, I use the metaphor of, well, let's say there's somebody following you around, stabbing you in the shoulder with a penknife.
Calm.
I could give you an opiate so it wouldn't hurt so much, but wouldn't it be better to stop the guy from stabbing with the penknife? I mean, I'm laughing. I really shouldn't. It's not funny, but it's kind of a humorous.
So if they manage to, how painful is it for them to actually break it off? Because it's a tremendous loss for them, just like anyone. But so how do you deal with that piece of it? Where
if they break off from therapy,
you've begun to break the bond with their parents.
Yes.
And it's agonizing for them.
Okay, but if it works, which it usually did, by the way, sometimes it was more complicated than we thought, but if they stuck with it, it worked, but they didn't cut off their parents. All of a sudden, they wanted to forgive them. That's the big story. Do you have to forgive them? I'd say, well, no, you don't have to forgive them. But if we do this right, you'll want to forgive them. And it was true. So they didn't cut off, but you had to do one parent at a time too. You couldn't, if you had two against one, it was really hopeless.
So if they,
and you had to detriangulate other people that would interfere first before you even approach the parents.
What was their parents' response to this?
Well, if they were empathic enough and they got through it, then the people started talking about it and they backed off a little bit.
So this
let's
sounds
agree
like,
not to
this
talk
sounds
about
like
that.
This sounds sort of like along the lines of Minuchin structural family therapy, except you're orchestrating it through the individual modality and sending them kind of out in the field to restructuring.
Restructure each individual separately, and like I said, other people will interfere, so you have to. I had strategies for what's called detriangulating.
But in each one, each time you restructure one, you're restructuring the whole system.
To a degree, but I said it's not your responsibility to fix your parents. You can't do that. If anything's going to help them, this would be it.
But you're not going to.
They may just be like that with everybody else, but with you'll fix your relationship with them.
How you feel about them, or how you live with them.
How you can express yourself without getting invalidated and still maintain a relationship with them. Okay. With each one.
Okay.
I have a question about what role, like self-compassion, like the way the patient feels about themselves throughout all this. How would you talk about, their own perception of them, like validation, obviously, but beyond that, is there, some of like, you have value or whatever it might be? Is that involved in
I find you don't really have to address that directly, because the way you communicate with them is communicating that it's not all you. Yeah, you're part of it and you're feeding into it yourself, but it's perfectly understandable why you do that. You're validating them, and they kind of internalize that to some degree. They still have those tapes. Like I said, I still, when I do something my parents would disapprove of that I think is fine, I still have a pang of, why am I doing this?
Well, how would they feel about you showing off tonight?
Well, I don't know. I've had a few people that have contacted me, a few ex-patients, because I've done several, podcasts, and I have a fan page, and I have 2 blogs. I was on Psychology Today for 10 years until there's some craziness going on in psychology these days with that have to do with they don't believe in clinical experience anymore. It's all, quote, research based, when the research base of what we're talking about is terrible for a number of reasons. But a lot of people read that stuff and they write to me, and I found a way to give advice without doing it, because I'm not licensed anymore because I retired. I always say, well, of course I can't say in your particular case, because there's a lot of different factors, but in general, and if this one might be what's going on, and they usually write back and go, how did you know? Oh, okay. So I
But
realized
with you, I think what I was
yeah.
sort of poking at was, you still have the neural networks there. You're just not letting them inhibit your behavior.
Well, I find that what's triggering those circuits is the parents or the communication.
Now, for you, you say that I still have some of that. So are you?
Yeah,
so,
you can't get. I'll say you can't totally stop the tapes from playing, but they won't bother you.
Like working on not listening to them, not giving it power, however you want to call it.
Well,
That-
right, but if there's more to this though, because families always, habits are hard to break. Okay, there's something called a game without end that Watzlawick, another influence on me, wrote about. Which, yeah, you say you want this to change, but do you really? You've always acted like you like it, so you don't trust it. So you do what you're asked, but you do it in some obnoxious way, and then they criticize you for it, and you go, see, they didn't really want.
So maybe I'm wondering, if you could talk more about the letting go of their parents, the grieving, being sad for them, forgiving them. Not that forgiving them, is the critical factor, but that they don't feel it so much as just that they harmed you, but in a sense, they have thrown away what could have been a wonderful relationship.
Well, I think they created what could be a wonderful relationship. Before they couldn't. I'm not sure exactly.
So I think Michael's asking, doesn't the person have to grieve the relationship that they longed for, that they never had?
Well, this is a way to sort of get a bit more of an approximation to that.
But what about the grief part? Do you think that that's a necessary?
I don't run into grief. What I run into is existential terror or groundlessness. What Masterson talked about, the same thing. He talked about post-individuation depression. But Yalom explained that. So it's really scary because you don't know who you are anymore. And all the normal cues you're responding to mean something different. And who am I anymore? It's terrifying.
Well, I find with a lot of the patients I work with that there's a particular mourning of the idealized parent that they wish they had. And in what they had, they missed a lot of normal, like we never had Christmas together. My dad was
well,
so they're grieving, they are aware of what they missed. I think that's what you're asking about, Michael. And then they have to go through some kind of mourning process. I'm never going to have that because it's gone.
I never thought about that, really, because I'll start ending therapy and I'll start telling them that the existential thought is very scary and I can understand why you're really, but it goes away and has a name, and then people they relax. But yeah, I found that even the people that have cut, I read advice columns, 4 of them, to see what people are talking about, and some people are bragging about the fact that they've cut off toxic parents, but you can tell there's always ambivalence, always. They really don't feel good about it, even if they're bragging like crazy about it.
I've had people who have essentially kept trying to work it out with their parents, but every time they would touch on it, their parents would throw them out for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years or whatever. And eventually, as they worked in therapy at that point, they began to see it was really, really painful.
Okay, but then I would want to know, what did you say that led to that reaction, and how can we get through that without wanting them to do that?
Okay, but let me just finish the piece
very
quickly, and then I'll try to answer that. So they have, they realize that it's never going to be, and they're angry. They've been robbed. They're still angry.
Yeah,
and then gradually they begin to see that how damaged their parents were, and how the parents threw away them, the grandchildren, it's just,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
they're sad because that the parents had lost this, and they begin to feel more comfortable with it then.
Well, to me, that's just all normal, and it's a process they go through, and they may, I suppose they might need a therapist at some point, but usually if they have a better relationship with their parent, it's much easier to accept for the very reasons you just listed, because they can see it's a shame that happened
Mhm.
for grandma and grandpa. They were Holocaust survivors or whatever, but it's a fact. There's that you can't change the past. I mean, that
You can't change the past,
can't
but
change the past.
people will believe, anything if necessary to hang on.
Hang on. Yeah,
But
okay.
it's kind of like magical thinking, and the how do they how I think another way of getting them to the spot where they can be free of this horrible relationship. You're making it better. You're improving the relationship.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be great, but it's got to be. They've got to quit feeding into the problem all the time. That's basic.
Now that would be wonderful, but sometimes one of the parents dies, and the benign parent, so to speak, the one who is kind of turning a blind eye, is left there, but they're still blind. It never happened the way you saw it.
Well,
And
the parents are doing their own number with each other and after death, all that stuff. Okay.
But I think the question that this brings up is, aren't there some cases where not having contact with a toxic system is the healthier alternative?
Well, I think there's three possibilities. The worst thing is to continue in the toxic relationship.
Right.
Okay. The best thing would be to fix it completely. But because almost no therapists do this, and because it's extremely difficult work, the help isn't available for a lot of these people. So in that case, the best thing is to cut them off. But
Okay.
it's not it's the second best thing in general, but it's the best thing.
Yeah. But at times it does necessitate a disconnect.
If they're still abusing you and you can't
Which
stop
I think is different than a cutoff. I think a cutoff is a disconnect without you resolving the issue, your own emotional reactions and feelings about it. A cutoff is when you just cut it off and you don't deal with it because you're
communicating. Right.
Yes. And Bowen talked about that in that the best way for his residents to know that they weren't going to play a role in their families, to go back and see if they resume that role when they go back to visit.
Yeah, that was where I based this on. I took ideas from other places to kind of do that, solve that criticism of him not having to, do paradox on his own parents, but to talk about the real issues. You can't solve a problem unless you can talk about it.
Now I want to ask a question to
Sure.
the rest of you. This is an excruciating experience for me, not because of anybody doing anything wrong, but just thinking about traumatized children and all cases I've known of that and what they went through. And it brings the pain of that back for me. And at the same time, that pain helps me do this work, because it's that, but it's that, you talked about these basic synapses, and the oldest part of the nervous system is the autonomic. So it's before there was a lot of intellectualization, before you could talk, before you could do anything. When you were a sea slug, you could be
Respond.
comfortable or uncomfortable. And I like to frame this sensation as kind of the switch is on or off, and when it's on because you're getting something wonderful or you're having something horrible happen. And the more you begin to weave together, you can tolerate it, and then see that actually having it on allows you to have a much fuller experience. You don't do it. But once you begin to get a taste of how it doesn't have to be this way, it begins to work out. Does that make any sense from your perspective?
Yeah. I'm asking also about how the therapist has to hear all these horrible stories.
Well, yeah,
without going home and shooting yourself or something.
Well, I think that if we don't, because are in a way.
Actually, a lot of us do. I mean, there are a lot of mental
Yeah,
health
sure.
professionals that are killing themselves now. We had, yeah, it's bad.
All kinds of professionals are killing
Yeah,
themselves. It's
but the highest rate is with mental health professionals.
so.
I don't know. My way, I've always, I'm very empathic and I can feel for people, but I've always been able to maintain the distance as an uninvolved observer. I don't know how I do it. Maybe it's my personality or something like that.
Do you think
I mean,
that's
I've only lost one patient that I had in therapy to suicide, but she shot herself in front of me. She had brought her gun to previous.
That was lovely.
She had brought her gun to the previous therapist. She brought it to the ER, and they called me, and I was able to talk her out about it. At that time, she brought it to my office, and everybody was amazed that I came back to work the next day. I felt crummy last night. I didn't sleep very well, obviously. It's not like it didn't affect me at all. In fact, her kids sort of weren't surprised because they kind of knew she was going to do this, and they were worried about me. I mean, it was really kind of a strange.
Oh, after something like that happened to me once, I was really, almost phobic about certain things.
Well, I don't think if somebody brought a gun to a previous therapist's office, I wouldn't do it again. Put it that way. Once was enough.
Well, I had a patient who almost ran me through with a window opener. This was at Bellevue, and I had made the mistake of sitting on the wrong side of the desk. And so I couldn't get out, and then he had the window opener. And how I got out of that was just pure luck, because without, I said, I don't have the keys to let you out. And he said, well, where are the keys? I said, they're in the nursing station. I said, should I get them? He said, yes. So I got in the station, slammed the door shut, and, it's all wire in the glass there. And they called for 6 security people, and they took a mattress and hold him down with a mattress so he couldn't hurt anyone. But, left a mark for a while.
Yeah, well, I'm not minimizing that at all. I mean, part of the reason I got interested, I had another patient, this very small woman. I wanted to discharge her from the hospital, and she tried to kill me. Luckily, she's a small woman, because why would anybody want to stay in a mental hospital? But it was partly my fault for being unempathic. I should have asked her, why are you afraid to go home? The analyst never taught me to ask that question.
Yeah, no, I get that. It's they're doing it for a reason, a good reason.
A good reason. Yeah, but I don't know why they didn't teach that. In fact, I was told by the analysts when I did an elective that don't ask for a history. That's another reason.
What?
I'm not kidding. The analyst said just go with the flow of what's happening now in the transfer.
I had a good supervisor who, every time I was going to do something that would get me killed by the power in the cult, he'd say, well, this patient is really severely obsessive, and the chairman's going to have trouble giving you advice. They're going to give you advice, and you're going to come back and say it didn't work. That's not going to make him happy. It's not going to do you any good. Do not present that patient.
Oh, and I just love what he said, don't take a history. Well, how do you know what's going on if you don't take a history? I mean, that was just shocking to me that it was that cult-like. I mean, another introduction to groupthink when I didn't know what groupthink was. I mean, because you have to know that the history gives you a background. You may not get all the information you need, or it may be slightly distorted, or maybe very distorted, but at least you've got a starting point.
Somewhere to start.
You got to start somewhere.
Wow, that's wild. David, I have a question. What advice would you pass along to young people in the field?
Well, it's real hard to do the kind of treatment that this is long-term treatment. It was, people ask me how many sessions. Well, 70 to 120, somewhere in that range. And I did it every 2 weeks. A lot of insurance won't pay for it anymore. But there's a lot of things going on that have come together all at the same time that make it almost impossible for therapists to do this kind of work. So I don't know if I knew politically how to handle this, but between the drug companies, the insurance companies, and this huge widespread sense of guilt among parents, because we haven't really solved the gender issue yet. People talk
Yep.
about having a career and children is real easy. Well, it's still stuck with the women mostly taking care of the children, and we haven't worked it out. So we have all these people making working mothers feel guilty. So they actually come home and spend more time with their kids than the 50s mom, where I grew up, spent with us, because they're so guilty, and they become helicopter parents. Okay. So if you say we got to work with the people to talk about the parents and say you're just blaming parents and that they have some kind of a brain disease. Everything is now a brain disease. Everything. Conduct disorder. We used to call that juvenile delinquency. Oppositional defiant disorder. Spoiled brat disorder is what it should be called. It's parenting. I'm sorry. You know, you think parents have no effect on their kids? Well, it's all peer pressure. Well, which peer group did they go to? Are they a goth? Are they an athlete? Are they a brain? Are they? What do you think? That's an accident? Which group they choose to hang out with?
But it gets at the ease of you have a diagnosis and you have a pill, and you don't have to make the changes.
A pill for everything. So antidepressants are being grossly overprescribed. That's
But what
another thing.
about what would you say to young early career psychotherapists from your position
All your
of
wisdom.
experience and wisdom? What would
Well,
you
this is a political question, really. It's you've got to you got to band together. Like I said, you can't do it individually. Got doctors are the worst. They're a bunch of wusses. They really are. They've let managed care started in the 80s when I started private practice back then, and it's just gotten worse. And the AMA has done nothing, as far as I can tell, to stop it. And now all these administrators are taking over. There's been like 5 times the number of administrators than they were 10 years ago, and maybe 10% more doctors. So if you don't band together and fight this stuff, you're lost. But patients are getting screwed right and left. You know, if you can't give them a pill, too bad. You know?
Well, you can't even get an appointment today.
Well, you can't even get an appointment. Yeah. Well, but they don't spend any time with you, even if you do get in. I mean, I would, I write that if you go to a therapist and they don't spend an hour with you in the first session, then find somebody else, or at least 45 minutes. They don't even ask a social history, or they believe anything you tell them when it seems strange, you know. But they don't even ask about it most of the time. It's really, I hate to be a critic of the field all the time, but there's some things that are going on. I mean, there was this guy who worked at the university that believed that everybody was bipolar pretty much, and he is the biggest name in the business. He's passed away now, but every bipolar too. That's the phoniest diagnosis in the world. I mean, I've actually asked about the criteria twice in 45 years. I found patients that actually met the criteria, but they both responded to lithium, so they probably had a mild case of bipolar 1.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a patient that's been on lithium for 40 years because of one sleep-deprived hypomanic episode. And no one ever really did an evaluation. They just kept prescribing. And now she finally is weaning off it. But it's done damage to her, and I don't think it's helped her.
Oh my God.
Well, she didn't need it. I mean, I always tell these stories because they're so bizarre. I had one patient that was a real hospital around here that's known for this. She had one symptom of mania, which was a spending spree. You know what she was spending her money on? Cocaine. Okay, well, cocaine mimics mania. Really? And they said, don't worry about this guy that I'm talking about. So don't worry about the duration criteria.
Oh my God.
It's arbitrary anyways. You know, don't even ask about it. What do you mean don't ask about
Don't
it?
even
How do you differentiate somebody who's reacting to something?
Look, I think I don't use much in the way of meds, but I think they're way overused. But I've had patients who, on relatively low doses of lithium, have their symptoms go away, their depression, the cycling stopped.
Yeah.
A little bump, and then they.
Well, okay. I mean, I guess that happens. I haven't had that experience, but.
Well, listen, we're going to have to call an end to our time together tonight. David, Alan, Dr. David Allen, I want to thank you very much for taking time to share your expertise with psychotherapists around the world. And hopefully that you'll come back again for another visit, because there's a lot more you'd like to we'd like to hear from you.
You
So
are
thank you
you are uniquely courageous.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And we'll hang around for a couple minutes afterwards. Thank you, David.
Okay, thanks again for having me.